Hey, Charles.
Hey, Arthur. How's it going?
Crazy busy, but
Yeah.
you know,
Well, here we are, huh? Are you guys
we
getting
are.
bad weather today too in New Orleans?
Yeah, so we may be clicked off.
Yeah. We
But
all lose power. The meeting's over, huh?
yeah, the system is kind of iffy today. It's starting to be real windy here. So,
Yeah.
hey, Colleen.
Hey Arthur, good to hear you. How
Yeah,
are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm actually, my camera's off because I have my little dog who's flipping out because of the weather.
Mm,
So she's attached to me like at the hip. As you can see.
Hey, Camille. We're trying to get my screen sharing to work. I'm not sure. Can you guys see my screen, my green slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Hello, Camille and Janika.
Hey guys, how y'all doing?
Great.
And I'm just adding some folks that are joining as attendees, making sure they get on the panelist side, and then we'll be ready to start any minute now. Camille, I think we've got almost everybody, and the rest are coming over. Well, we're close to time, and we have a quorum. Camille, should we start on Gina, or however we want to do this? I think we should get started, and I think the rest of people can join us as they get here.
Sure, sounds good. So I'll just jump right in and call to order the meeting of the Climate Initiatives Task Force Committee on Land Use, Buildings, and Housing for March 17th, 2021. And if you could, let's see, mark the official the beginning of this meeting, and if Charles, you could do a roll call, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
I will do that. Let me add Kevin into our group first. Okay, Gina Campo.
Here.
Camille Manning Broom.
present.
Dr. Fallon Adu.
Here.
Thank you. Camille Pollan. Dr. Kevin Conrad. I think that's who we'll come back to. Dr. Conrad, are you on? Okay. Archie Hall.
Here.
You. Jason Hewitt. Mark Goodson.
Here.
Thank you. Arthur Johnson.
Here.
Kim Marisek.
Here.
Thank you. Andronika Morris.
I think she's muted.
I see you there. Can you say, just for the record, on? There she goes.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. No, I knew you were here. We just needed to hear it. Thank you. Dr. Zhu Ning.
Here.
Louisette Scott. Z. Smith.
Here.
And Chris Tyson. Did I not say anybody, did anybody not get a chance to say they were here, that's here?
I think you saw
Okay.
Kevin, but has
I do
Kevin
see
spoken?
Kevin on there. But we have a quorum, so I think we're ready to get going.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Very excited about this meeting because I think we're really getting into the meat of things now. And I know that you were emailed some materials by Charles prior to the meeting. So one of those things was the minutes from the last meeting, and then also some documents to get you thinking about the strategies and actions for implementation of building, land use, and housing climate initiative recommendations that we're going to be talking about today. So at this time, unless Camille, you have anything that you want to say, I'd like to ask for a motion for approval of the minutes of our last meeting.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion passes. So with the approval of the minutes, we will move to kind of an overview of where we are going, starting today with our work. And Charles Sutcliffe is going to give us a briefing on that. And we can have a little question and answer if you need to get any clarification on what the goals are specifically for the meeting. But I think once you hear Charles's explanation, it'll be pretty clear, and then we'll just get right down to work after that. So without any further ado, Charles, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Gina. And I will try to do all my talking at the front and let the committee kind of talk for most of this meeting. It's gonna be really good. So as Gina mentioned, we are here to kind of really start doing some work. Our main goals for today are to develop a draft list of strategies related to our sector. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on that, I think, at the most. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our meeting brainstorming potential actions that would fall under those big strategies. So these are the ideas that you guys have, I know you guys have tons of ideas, and this is going to be really good. We'll spend about 80 minutes on that. The last 15 or 20 or so of that will be to assign people kind of some homework, if you will, to kind of to kind of make sure that somebody will be in charge of developing that action further, turning it into a official submittal through our process. And then finally, at the very end, we want to talk a little bit about our April meeting. In April, we want to bring all the groups together, similar to the way we did in February, but with a focus on cross-sector pollination or talking to people in different silos other than ours is our main goal. So, but today is really a brainstorming meeting and about big thinking, and it's not about identifying reasons why things aren't going to work. We have other stages of the process that we can do that. So today is about getting ideas out onto the table. So we have gotten a few questions related to kind of the process, like what happens to these actions and what is the exact role of the committees through these actions. So we wanted to kind of just hit a few of these that we have heard from other committee members and from the public, just so we can all be kind of a little more clear. And then, as Gina said, if anybody has any additional questions, we can try to get those answered now quickly. So some of the questions we have received is just about, again, what is the process for submitting actions? What happens once one is received by the task force? How are these proposed actions evaluated or weighed? Am I allowed to collaborate with other committees, with general public? How does that work? And then finally, how does the public submittals, the ones that don't come from a committee member, for example, how do those get incorporated in the process? So we're going to try to hit on a few of these, just so everybody's kind of on the same page. So first of all, what is the committee going to be doing during this part of the process? We've got today's meeting, like I said, our goal is to identify a list of potential actions and assign committee members to kind of draft them out. In April, we'll meet again as a committee, but as part of this cross-sectoral, cross-pollination emphasis, where we want to refine select draft actions and get additional feedback. At the end of April is when the public submission deadline is going to be. So April 30th is when anybody who's submitting an action, whether you're a task force member or a committee member or a member of the public. And then so in May, we'll be able to come back together. We'll be able to discuss sector related actions that have come in from anywhere. So whether, anybody that submitted one, we'll have everything to review come May. We will have a chance to meet again in August. And we can talk about that in a second to kind of work after we see some of the feedback from the advisory committees to kind of refine some of our actions. But I would say that the bulk of our work is going to be really in this March, April, May kind of timeframe. So we're going to be very busy kind of developing these actions and getting them forward. I would say too, our role is, this is a group of experts. We brought you guys together because you know a lot about your area and you have good ideas. But the final decisions about what strategies and actions get into the Louisiana official climate report are going to fall on the task force. And so we're just here to develop actions out, make sure there's as well thought out as they can be, and help to evaluate and sort and kind of, take in public ideas. But the final decisions are going to be at the task force level. So then on the proposal side, the question is, what actually happens to these actions once they get turned in? And so I just want to kind of walk you through this diagram. Hopefully it'll be a little bit helpful. So we're here at the very beginning where actions are coming in from everywhere. All the different sector committees are meeting in this kind of month to kind of go through ideas, generate ideas just like we're doing. We will post all of the actions that are received on the climate website. And then we're also planning on kind of sending out kind of regular updates to everybody associated with it, including the public, just in terms so they can kind of know what's been submitted this week and kind of see what's come in. Submitted proposals will be, that'll happen through the April 30th deadline. So then submitted proposals will be sorted into relevant sectors and cross-cutting themes and discussed at our May meeting. So that brings us to this middle, where the cells, where all the actions get grouped into the little cell-looking things there. So that's kind of where we'll be in May. Then we'll report out to the task force on all the different actions that have been received. The planning team is going to help organize those actions across the strategies. It could include, a little bit of combining things here and there, filling in gaps, highlighting alternative approaches to kind of accomplish the same goal. And then those organized actions will be put into hypothetical portfolios. So that's where we're going to be able to start getting into the evaluation stage. Once they're kind of organized in these portfolios, we can start to see, evaluate them against the fundamental objectives. Then we can, then again, this is kind of bringing to the middle of this bottom row, will be around the August timeframe. Once we've seen kind of how some of these portfolios perform against fundamental objectives, we can kind of talk again to revise actions based on feedback from the advisory groups. And then the formal trade-offs analysis will happen with the task force input and then leading up to a final strategy at the end of all this. And so that's kind of the broad overview of what happens to actions as they come in. And then some of the specific questions we've received so far on actions is this one action or multiple actions? Or am I talking about an action or a program? And do I need to fill out multiple templates kind of is the question. And so as we're going to talk about a lot today, an action is something that can be directly implemented. And so I think what we're asking people to do is just to think about how that action is going to be implemented. And if the details are largely the same, if it needs to happen at the same time as something else, or if the same organization or actor is in charge of kind of implementing it throughout, or the funding stream would be the same, then you probably have one action, even if it's programmatic. But if the thing that you need to see done is being done by two different types of partners or over different time scales, you probably are talking about two actions. And so we'd ask for a separate proposal in that. And then, but today, as we kind of think about actions, we don't need to get to that level of detail. It's more important today to kind of get all the ideas written down, and we can kind of figure out how many proposals that idea needs to be turned into at a later date. And then collaboration is another question that we've gotten a lot of. And I would say that in general and mostly collaboration is a good thing and very much encouraged. So we'd love to see it where multiple members of the same committee work together, where people work with members of other committees, where you get with an organization that you know well and you think that they would have a great idea and collaborate with them to kind of get a proposal into the system. The only thing that we don't want and we can't have is to have a quorum's worth of committee members working on a proposal together. We just want this to be a public process as much as possible. And so we just want to be true to that and keep that going. So if you find yourself with more than half of this group getting together to work on one idea, I'd ask that you kind of not do it that way, and we can find a way to kind of come together formally to talk in that way. But other than that, collaboration is really good. And then kind of also on the collaboration side, there's no popularity contest component to this work. And so all these actions that come in, whether we receive the action one time or 75 times, we are going to be considering them against the fundamental objectives and evaluated as part of the trade-offs analysis. So having more people voting for one action does not necessarily benefit you through the process. So we're not worried about that as we do this. And that is the last one that I wanted to cover. Does anybody else have a question from the committee about what happens to actions or what happens in our process that we need to answer today?
I think the biggest question that I had when I saw the 14-page submittal was it implies a whole bunch of, implies that each of us has a staff, a really great staff of like 5 or 6 people who are going to go figure out, well, what would that cost? And exactly how many, kilowatt hours or tons of carbon would it save? And so if it sets up an incredibly high bar, and yet when we have an open meeting and people call in and suggest, it's often at the level of, I think we should do X, and none of that is provided. So I'm just curious, I'm sure you've discussed this, how do we get from a long list of things that sound like good ideas to what that form is structured for, which is fully documented costs, benefits, who wins, and so on. What would it take to make that happen? You've probably thought about this, so I'm just curious what you were thinking.
Yes, so we do know that there is a high bar on the one form. We do want people to be submitting ideas no matter what level of detail they're able to provide. So we do kind of want both of those things. We know that in the end of the day, we're going to ask the task force to be evaluating against all those different fundamental objectives. Yeah, I have to have it. So we kind of are aware of both those things at the same time. Just lost my train of thought. Colleen, can you kind of take over for me? Somebody.
Yeah.
Save us, Colleen. Speaking of great staff, Colleen, please.
Yes.
The short answer I would say, Z, is to fill it out to the knowledge as best as you have it, while recognizing, I don't think we're asking for anyone to take on full-time work to fill out the action proposals. We know that there's going to be gaps in most of those, even coming from the committees, but we wanted to be thorough to kind of make sure that we're asking those questions we know that we're going to need to ask at least down the line once we get into implementation, and where you have answers or even partial answers, ways of thinking about, magnitude of things, that you put that down. So we're not asking you to go run a model and say, okay, this is going to reduce this by this amount. Right. We'll be doing some of that evaluation on the back end. But if you have, a sense of magnitude, that's just where we ask you to put that information.
Got it. So it's okay to leave some things blank or see to be determined.
Completely.
Absolutely okay to leave blanks.
That's great. Normally I just make stuff up, but I like it better if we can just leave it.
Either or. Thanks. Fallon, I saw your hand too.
Yes. I have a question about, that's very similar. I had that question, but my other question is about kind of variability in what kind of evidence supports different kinds of proposals. And so we have some that a much more qualitative record of impact would be more compelling. And in other cases, I mean, even a more kind of experiential understanding of what that particular strategy is would really be of value. How are we collecting that information that does not come in a very kind of quantitative format?
That's a great point. I think some of that is on the submitter side. I mean, in terms of what are they providing, I think our version of evidence would be as broad as can be. You know, I wouldn't want to not hear those kinds of actions. In terms of our process, how we kind of at the end of the day kind of get them on even playing field to make it make a determination. That is a good question, and I don't know that I can pinpoint where that'll get sorted out. Colleen, do you have a thought on that piece?
Yeah, I'll say on the evaluation side that we know that there's going to be both qualitative and quantitative ways that we're looking really across, you know, each of those fundamental objectives on how we consider things, and also that as we do that in that sort of final trade-off analysis round, that we'll be looking at sort of a suite of actions together as well. So it's not going to be like your action is individually scored, you know, and if it scores a 78 or above, it's in, and if it's below, it's not. It's going to be kind of considered a bit more holistically. So hopefully that kind of helps to answer that question, but I would say that qualitative responses, even on things that are quite quantitative, even on something that is about greenhouse gas emissions, are very much welcomed in the action template. So if your responses are mostly qualitative, I think that's very appropriate.
And one like minor follow-up is that that kind of last trade-off analysis, some would call high stakes analysis at the end, is the rubric for that going to be publicly made publicly available, or is this a kind of much more kind of subjective internal evaluation?
So the advisory groups will be particularly tasked with supporting the evaluation side, and also tasked with developing the rubric. So those, even the next meetings of the advisory groups, is to begin discussing some of those defined impact scales that will kind of set the rubric for that. And then we're also looking at some modeling tools to use on the greenhouse gas emissions side to do some of those more quantitative measurements.
And I would just say, just generally, our commitment is to show as much of this to the public as possible at all steps. So that's going to be our aim throughout in general. And then Camille?
Yeah, and just to clarify, so we as a group will be, but not all, will be assigned to develop different action templates based on the strategies. We're also going to receive the public action templates that come to this group. Then there will be conversation and build out of those, but then they go through the legal, the equity, the legal, finance, and jobs, and then what's the other one? The fourth one?
Science.
No, and the science committees, advisory committees. So they're filtered through there first, and then go into the larger rubric system of prioritizing before they then move to the task force. Is that right?
Yes, right. So I'm bringing this slide back up.
Yeah.
This is better. And some of it has to do with what level the evaluation is being done at, I think, right? Some of the fundamental objectives are being done at the big level. Are we moving in the right directions and stuff? Whereas some of the advisory groups can kind of weigh in with a what's the name of the scale? Fancy name for the scoring rubric at the action level. So I think so we can kind of see right? Is that right, Colleen, at the action level?
So they'll be evaluating at that portfolio level, but they will be commenting on specific actions and elements of specific actions and how they do that. And so that evaluation by the advisory groups will then be shared also with this group, and there'll be an opportunity in August to discuss revisions to action and make some of those, fill some gaps, revise some things, work with some of the other sector committees to just improve actions that then get folded into that trade-off analysis for the task force to make decisions on.
So while, for example, a action item might not have a big impact right now on actual emission reductions, it could be a policy program that could lead to cultural shifts and have big equity considerations and would be lifted up through that the equity lens, and so through that committee, and same goes with maybe laws and things like that. So just because it doesn't have a number doesn't mean it won't rise to the top.
Exactly. Okay, those are great questions. Anybody else have a question? Okay, so I think for the next, sorry, Gina, go ahead.
You might have said this already, but so the report out to the task force is that in May?
That is at post May, right? Is it maybe early May versus late May? When's that task force meeting scheduled? I think, I know we have to wait till May to kind of have all the actions submitted from the public, and we want to have one more chance to kind of go through it as a committee. And then the task force will have to have kind of see the full playing field after that.
I think it will be early June, but we'll work to get that on the calendar.
Okay, great.
So it's not a last minute thing. Yeah.
But there's that sequencing there is important. Yeah. Okay. Well, then I think we're ready to kind of talk about some strategies. And so again, these are the big big picture, high level pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're talking about these ideas are to help us kind of organize ourselves so that when we get into the action level, that next level down, we're not kind of jumping around too much, and we're able to kind of think all the way through a strategy before we kind of move on to the next thing. So I just think this is mostly to kind of ground us in terms of what, big picture things should be on the table. And again, today is about brainstorming, and it's about broad ideas and idea generation. And we can modify these later. And what I'm about to show is just a starting menu. This is from something that we've gathered from this committee's earlier thoughts at our first meeting, some of the best practices that were presented at the last full meeting that we all had together, as well as some research and different ideas that have come in from group members. So we're just trying to put this up as a starting point. And I just want everybody to kind of think about, if some of these ideas are up here, but it could be made different and be more successful for Louisiana, that's great. And then we can worry about whether this is really an action level or a strategy level at another time. It's just really about just kind of getting good ideas out there. And so we shared this with you all earlier this week. It wasn't a lot of time, but I'm hoping that this looks at least familiar. This looks pretty good, like a good starting point. And I would just love to kind of offer it up to you guys so I can stop talking to see if you have any questions, comments, additions, modifications, or things that you wanted to kind of say in response to some of this list. And I don't know, Camille or Jean, if you wanted to walk through it piece by piece or how you wanted to do it, but love to hear from the group.
I think it would be, so it might be good to do an example, unless you guys all want to walk through each one, but we're going to walk through each one anyway through to develop the action items. And so I would suggest as an example, so reduce carbon footprint of new construction. that's the strategy. And then the actions are all the steps, the how to get there. And so Z, you're our expert on this. What's some examples of the actions to do this?
Sure. So the idea would be to help the state promote industries to shift over the carbon intensity of the materials that we make. As an example, the manufacture of concrete, there's a significant spread in the carbon footprint of different ways to make concrete. There's stuff in the labs of basically zero carbon footprint concrete or at 1/10 the current levels. However, in terms of available choices, there's still a significant spread. Some states are implementing actions that provide preference towards those innovating in that direction. And so with any of these things, the idea would be if the state, through their actions, promoted these industries, that could help, help Louisianans in that way. So at one extreme is just lowering the carbon footprint of conventional materials, to working to expand the building codes to allow the use of wood in more construction than it currently is. A lot of states and municipalities are moving in that direction, working, basically working with their fire officials and so on to get everyone on the same page. And that could also promote a very strong Louisiana industry of forestry, of sustainable forestry. And then the final one is as the things that have interactions with land use, which is to say a significant fraction of the carbon footprint of new construction in single family houses is all the infrastructure. It's not the houses themselves, they're stick frame 1- and 2-story wood. The majority of the carbon footprint is actually from the roads, the sewer treatment facilities, and all that kind of stuff. So things that promote livable, walkable, denser communities than everybody living on a 1/4 acre lot are things that lead to much lower housing, the same number of people with a much lower carbon footprint and still having a nice quality of life. So those are just some quick examples. So it's making the materials themselves better, making the choices easier to use the lower carbon things that are already available to us, and then helping when new construction happens, having it happen in a way where the implications of that work, like the infrastructure, are the footprint of that is minimized.
Well, you just wrote our first action template.
So,
and I recorded. We just need to dictate it.
Yeah, that's really good. And what I think everybody, for the whole group, like it shows how there are multiple actions that can fall underneath the strategy. Anyway, that was a great example. Thank you for that. And so, and as everybody else I know that you guys have got other action ideas too. What we need to be thinking about at this stage of the meeting is just does the action that I want to do, where I know is important, does it have a home underneath one of these strategies? And if it doesn't fit underneath one of these, we probably need to add something to the list or change the list somehow so that that action does have a place in here. So that's kind of what we're looking at this stage.
I was going to say others should speak to it, but I think that the second bullet about equitable retrofits of existing buildings speaks a lot to improving, the quality of life among all communities in Louisiana, and structuring things. It's easiest, all of the programs around energy efficiency in the state up until now, almost all of them, not all of them, most of them, the easiest thing to do is to go after some huge grocery store and change their lights. But that's very different than going after improving the quality of life of people who are living in maybe substandard housing to begin with. And that by improving that, we can make things much fairer and much more resilient when there are power outages and so on. So I think that thinking new construction is all shiny and new and easy to think about. It's a much gnarlier problem to talk about how we do a deep conversion of our building stock in a way that improves equity rather than increases disparities.
And so that's adding equitable retrofit to existing structures.
Yeah.
And that's great, Z, because you bring up another point in the template. There's a section to describe and lift up how it addresses equity, and that'll be great for moving these items up in priorities too. Charles, do
I
you
would
want to?
add that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead,
Colin.
please.
Just on that one thing, documentation of the buildings that are being at issue there is a huge component of this problem. And there's a lot of inequity around building documentation. And so if there was even simple, like document utilize existing buildings, that would be like a simple change. But I think that's one nod to this larger question.
So does that go, that would go under the action template of, or part of one of the actions is requiring that documentation? I'm trying to make sure
Well,
I
I
heard
guess
you right, Fallon.
I guess if utilize existing buildings, it is up at this level, they could just as another kind of pre-action is just like document and assess existing buildings. Like, I feel like we're not yet at the point where we're even at that action point.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a good clarification. That's great.
And Dr. Ning, I know you had mentioned in our last meeting around including green spaces, landscaping, also around incentivizing use for green infrastructure and land use planning. Those are up there. I don't know if if you're happy with how those strategies are worded.
Yes, I did mention that in the meeting, and also I compiled some tables for the task force science advisory group. Basically, we're looking into the state of Louisiana in the amount of urban land and total tree canopy cover with those trees. How much CO2 trees have already sequestrated if we keep the canopy cover as one of the strategies, and then we would deliver those sequestration carbon storage numbers. In my table, I do have the total amount of carbon that's stored by those existing trees, total amount of CO2 equivalent gas, greenhouse gases that those trees remove them through photosynthesis, and also amount of storm water runoff trees prevented, and amount of energy that a tree can save, basically by reducing the heating and cooling and reducing the usage of fossil fuel, and reducing the emission from the power plants that's used to manufacture those heating and cooling related energy. So strategy would be, we can set up a canopy goals if we can use the current data I have in the table I compiled as a benchmark. From there, we can set up a tree canopy goals, how many % of a tree canopy should have in the urban area to reach to certain higher number of sequestration and storage. That's in a nutshell.
This is Arthur. We look under land use planning, and particularly the last two bullets dealing with access for all communities for healthy, fresh food. I think, that also needs to have nutrition education now with that, because in these communities, and particularly in the underserved communities, the access, fresh food access, which is of course very wide, but the communities are not always educated about nutrition and the importance of that. So I think they kind of go together, and not just making sure providing access to healthy fresh food, but also understanding the importance of healthy fresh food and what is healthy fresh food. For example, community has sometimes been led to believe that things that say organic are better than non-organic. But, for those of us that are studying and educating this, that's not always the case. but particularly for the underserved and communities of color, that term organic, which also means that it's more expensive, and wants to imply that it's better for you, which is not necessarily the case. I also think that revitalizing neighborhoods that are historically underserved, again, what we're also dealing in our communities in these neighborhoods, historically underserved doesn't necessarily mean that they're currently, and that gentrification is coming into these neighborhoods and communities that were traditionally or historically underserved, or communities of color, and changing that. So revitalizing those communities, I think it needs to be looked at maybe a little further. Are these communities truly in need, and are they still communities of underserved, whether they were historically there or that's the framework for it? And I'm from Washington, D.C., for example, and and even in New Orleans in the Lower Ninth Ward, we're seeing a massive change. So neighborhoods that would be considered quote unquote historically underserved are changing because of gentrification and that basis. And revitalization is not necessarily going to have the great impact for those communities of color and underserved community residents if they're no longer majority in those neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Those are very good points. I saw a comment though about, let's see, this was specifically about buildings and housing. We should add this to the transportation and land use as well. Yeah, I could see how there's some crossover with all three of those in your comments. But I wanted to also add one other thing to, and I don't know if this is appropriate for buildings and housing. I think it is, but when we're talking about retrofitting existing structures and also in planning the, for new construction, I would add broadband. I mean, I see that for, access to technology, because that's going to have a vector with, transportation and land use planning, and it's going to help support a lot of reduction in greenhouse, carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions, with different types of work patterns and shopping patterns and things like that, and learning patterns.
I'm sorry, I want to go back. Author, do you want to make changes to this strategy, or should we work together on later and making changes to the strategy and then building out the action items to address the concerns that you raised on the healthy fresh food, access to fresh food, and neighborhood revitalization of underserved or marginalized areas?
Yeah, we can work that out, because I think
okay.
It's not necessarily an easy fix, shall we say, just to plug it in word, but I think we can work that out, and I definitely want to be part of that. And also I want to say that when we talk about retrofit existing structures, I guess it's more of a question, where does historic districts play in this? Because that becomes a challenge, particularly, and again, I'll go back to the Lower Ninth Ward. Parts of it are historic districts. And so this whole idea of retrofitting structures gets into, particularly in districts where they were traditionally underserved, or communities of color that, and older residents cannot afford to do the retrofit of historic districts. They have to make it look, it existed, it began, and that becomes a challenge, particularly those on fixed income, and I guess those would be considered lower income resources, but fixed income, where these, we want to have these structures be lower emissions, but also from the historic district, that also presents a challenge, because that's a battle with these historic districts. And historic district identification is also being used in other communities that weren't traditionally historic district, kind of either move people out. It's to me, is another form of gentrification, and particularly those on fixed income and limited income basis in communities that traditionally weren't identified or labeled as historic districts. So me somewhere, and that may be something to work out as well, but I think we need to look at what, where historic districts, and I don't know if that's a state issue or if that's a local issue or both, but yeah,
I think Arthur, you make a great point. I think once we start getting into how we do this and like who's doing it and kind of these kind of details, I think we are kind of in the action phase. And so I think we're ready to switch over to that category. I just want to make one last call. If anybody has an idea, maybe something in this transportation crossover group that they see something missing, or maybe everybody's ready to kind of start getting into the action level.
This is Kim.
Yeah,
I just wanted to make a comment, or maybe see if there was an opportunity to maybe create some strategies that are a little bit, maybe that incorporate all three of the sectors, because I think many of the things we're talking about cross over the building and housing, land use and transportation, and maybe into other sectors. So things like aligned disaster recovery, mitigation, and adaptation programs. I would like to add in there the Watershed Initiative program. And maybe there's some things that we want to talk about a little more holistically in this list. And for example, thinking about that first bullet of reducing carbon footprint of new construction, I think that's a very broad statement, and there's land use implication, and there's building code implication, and there's material implications under that. And so I wonder if we want to be that broad, or if we want to be more specific with our strategies, because I think the action steps could get very long if the strategies are very broad like that. And so maybe some of these are really elevated to like a goal statement and less of a strategy statement. And then the other thing I wanted to kind of add in there is thinking about things like green space and landscaping, and also incentivizing, I think we have it on the land use side, preservation and enhancement to public health. I think maybe, again, thinking about how we link those together, maybe as a strategy, or just to be more explicit as to why those are separate strategies. So that was what I wanted to add in there. And I'd be happy to like work with anybody to kind of wordsmith some of that.
Yeah, picking up on this is the grand thing that happens in any of these task force, the difference between goals, strategies, tactics, and initiatives that I'd like to do. And I think at this stage, we're at the brainstorming, we can kind of throw it all out and then resort and reclump as needed. But I think what you just said, Kim, was great in noting that some of these things have, huge implications. Some are much more focused. I was thinking a couple of, and I think they might even be down at the tactic level, but I'm not sure. When you hear the moves that are happening in other states, one is a move towards electrification versus locking buildings into being consumers of fossil fuels, as the grid is decarbonizing much more quickly than most folks said it was going to, while at the same time we're planning for resilience and storage. The storage and the production of the renewables and stuff, I think that's over in another task force committee. But when we talk about buildings, a lot of communities are basically saying, how do we make it so that when we build new buildings, we're not basically locking them into a lifetime of fossil fuel consumption when the whole world, you don't want to be the kind of last one on your block, as it were. Likewise, we're learning that natural gas, if we're going to be building new subdivisions, that natural gas, it turns out the leakage rate from the natural gas distribution system is such that as long as any part of a city is on natural gas, the global warming potential of just the leakage from that grid, even if it's less than 3%, makes the carbon footprint of burning clean natural gas much less clean because we're leaking all of that into the atmosphere. So it's not being anti-natural gas, but it's just saying, again, from a policy perspective, if we're interested in when we're doing new construction, or especially new developments and new neighborhood construction, we should be, it feels like electrification is something that a lot of other states have looked at. And when Arthur talked about historic buildings and historic neighborhoods, and there's probably a distinction in there that needs to be teased out more. It's certainly possible to do historic, to upgrade historic buildings in ways that make them both much lower consumer of energy, much more comfortable for the occupants and better for their health, as well as much more resilient when the power goes out so that they stay comfortable longer when there are power outages. And the key thing in all of this is, I think we're, not to put words in Arthur's mouth, but one obvious question is access to capital and access to the funds that fund these kind of retrofit actions. And making, there have been a lot of initiatives through green redevelopment banks and so on to make it so that people can get out ahead of these things and make that money available to people who have relatively little wealth. Because otherwise it's hard to accumulate wealth if you're paying a high bill, no matter how low your rates are, if your bill is high because your consumption's high, right? So I think that those may be down to the level of individual initiatives. I'm not sure where they fall in this hierarchy, but I think just to summarize again, equitable retrofits. The other thing is electrification. And then this speaks a little bit to what Fallon talked about, documentation. Most states are making big initiatives in transparency so that buildings that consume excessive amounts of energy, people find out that they're excessive, and often even are given access to funds for retrofitting those and improving or even retuning the existing buildings, not even so much a major retrofit for commercial buildings. And so we have, as a very trivial example, there's a state law on the books passed in 2000 or 2001 that requires all state buildings to publish their energy consumption, to identify the biggest consumers of energy, and to schedule them for tune-ups, essentially. And that, to my knowledge, has never been implemented. And it's never been implemented, I've told, because the legislature has never funded the position to implement the law. It could save the state millions and millions of dollars a year, as well as lower carbon emissions. So this notion of making information about what the buildings are and how they perform easier to get to and easier to put in context could be a really, high payoff, low investment strategy.
That's great. Thanks, Z. I see Kevin has a hand up. We haven't heard from him yet. And then we're going to switch over to actions, which I think we're already kind of there. So we're going to go ahead and officially switch to actions after we hear from Kevin. Go ahead.
Hey, I think my comments probably belong in actions, but I'll start now since maybe we're there. Yeah. And I don't know exactly how this will fit into this committee, and I've discussed it with Z, but I wanted to talk about the healthcare sector and possibly, a coalition of people within the healthcare sector leading and sort of setting up some goals for the state of Louisiana, possibly Ochsner joining with LCMC, possibly Lady of the Lake, and some other healthcare sectors, that we as an industry would set specific goals that we would try to achieve in the next few years. This has been done in other states, particularly it's been done in Massachusetts and in Boston, where they sort of broke this down by sector, and the healthcare sector had specific goals and they achieved those goals. So it's been very successful there. But I think as an industry, the healthcare sector is huge. It has a huge carbon footprint, and it's sort of ideally positioned to lead sort of a movement amongst an industry setting specific carbon emission goals. The leader in this area would be Kaiser Permanente in California, which is the largest healthcare system in the country, and they are carbon neutral through a variety of means. But I kind of wanted to see what the committee thought about that, whether the committee could support that, or just in general, what your thoughts are.
And Kevin, so that I understand, is this around a action item for the state to incentivize sectors to come together and accomplish these emission reduction goals through their buildings?
Well, it's not just buildings, it's in every facet of their operations. This is, entailing patient transportation, food services, obviously buildings as well. I didn't really see the state incentivizing as much as promoting. Certainly the state could incentivize, but I think this initiative would really be from the healthcare systems themselves. But to have the support of this committee, to have the support of the state would be great. Now that could be at the level of incentivizing. I didn't necessarily see that. And I think, obviously there'll be some built-in incentives, whatever they do. But I thought it would just be sort of driven at the level. Now, I don't see this. I would like, every healthcare institution in the state or the majority of them to buy into this. Not just one or two, but say, okay, yes, we're doing it. Christus is doing it, Ochsner's doing it, Lady of the Lake's doing it. That they would all sort of buy into this.
I think that's great, and I think that's definitely an action level. I just want to, as we kind of just flip over, and Colleen's going to share her screen in a second, so we can kind of take really specific notes on this. There are obviously strategies and actions that don't fall neatly within just our sector. I think Kim already kind of mentioned that there are things that go across three, there are things that go across multiple, and there are things that don't fit in any buckets. And so we are also kind of thinking about those as we go. And so just to members of this committee, don't feel hemmed in by our sector definition that we have here. If there's a economy-wide thing that you know about in another state, or you just have a great idea that fits in a different bucket, engagement and education is one, for example, that there's no committee to just think about how do we get people to understand what their options are and kind of know. Anyway, so there are other categories, we recognize that. And so I just wanted to make sure everybody is aware that we are not forgetting about these as well. But go ahead, Camille.
And I was just going to say, as we're thinking through, so Z, I've already jotted you down to be part of a conversation with the power distribution group because we have other questions for them. But as we're moving through this, if we can think about questions and we can just put them together ourselves that we might have for the different sectors or the advisory groups, we'll make a list of those. We can set up discussions. We can, send those questions to them, get responses. But that's something that we need to start making note of because we'll likely need those responses in order to put our action templates together.
Camille, I have a question for, I was really intrigued with what Juning brought up, which is that, urban forestry is one way to sequester carbon. Pound for pound, it's compared to other things you could do, it's more expensive than, say, afforestation of an area. On the other hand, the health implications and the equity implications and the livability implications are huge, and they have huge financial impact on the state in terms of improving the air quality in those neighborhoods, as well as the quality of life. Question for us when we're filling out these larger templates eventually, it says what's it's going to cost, and I'm assuming somehow it says what is the benefit. The benefit isn't just pounds of carbon, it's preventable deaths, it's better health, and that has a huge, with Kevin's observation about health, this intersection between health and equity. And yes, you get a carbon benefit, but it's almost like a co-benefit compared to the health benefit. So how can we have it that these proposals, properly show that their economics are not so much even about the carbon as they are about all of these other things, and it's just the carbon's nice to get. So how do we do the math? It's it's beyond me. I'm hoping that Juning has got it all in her back pocket.
Yeah, she probably does.
Yeah, I do have, as I say that Camille knows that, I shared that file with her before. On the table I compiled, in addition to the ecological benefits, which means carbon storage, sequestration, so on and so forth, I mentioned, on the table I do have scientific data shows the Louisiana's urban forests in terms of dollar value contributing to the state economy. The dollar value of those ecosystem services, especially the climate change mitigation effects, those dollar values are awarded costs. For example, if we don't have these trees exist in Louisiana, state of Louisiana, urban area, how much the city and the states have to pay in terms of to reduce these kind of greenhouse gases, store these amount of carbons, and so on and so forth. So I do have those data already.
Yeah, but the thing I want to focus on is, the wisecrack is, if you want to find where the poor neighborhoods are in any city or the minority neighborhoods are, you just look on the aerial map and you see where there are no trees. And so I think that recognizing that urban forestry is part of equity, and it has to happen at a big enough and fast enough scale. If we just do it at one neighborhood, then that neighborhood gentrifies and people move out. But if we can do it quickly and at scale, we could improve people's lives as well as sequester some carbon.
I hope the action template itself, Z, has some good ways for you to answer exactly those and think through exactly those questions. There's a whole section on impacts. So both anticipated, recognizing we're not asking you to hard measure unless you're able to, the sort of anticipated greenhouse gas emission reductions, but then also action co-benefits and also action burdens, recognizing that, both that there might not only be, co-benefits to some of the actions considered. And both of those questions have also an equity lens question of who is benefiting from the co-benefits and who is taking on some of those burdens. So that's great places to put both super quantitative measures where we have them, but also qualitative. And then to say too, where there's questions on costs that we're not anticipating like a full, full budget identified for these actions, or even recognizing that we won't be at the space of doing a full benefit cost analysis for any of these actions. That would need to kind of come further down in implementation, but we're trying to kind of capture all of those sort of qualitatively through the template at this point.
And I would just add too, kind of also to Z's point, is that we are kind of working at two different scales, right? We've got the math problem of the greenhouse gas targets that we're trying to get to. So we want to make sure that as we're putting strategies forward and actions forward, we're actually getting where we need to get. We're actually bringing down this central problem. But then we've also got the fundamental objectives that this committee seems to have internalized really well. I feel like a lot of them have come up in this conversation already. So we are able to measure against a lot of other good things that we want to see as we do this. So we're trying to have both as we kind of think through this as we go forward. And so since I have the floor real quick, I just want to just highlight again for the whole group and for the public that's watching, now that we're switching over to kind of action ideas, this is when we're trying to think about specific policies or programs or projects that can be directly implemented. So this is really where we want to spend, at least until 3:45, kind of talking about just brainstorming again about there are no bad ideas. There's no need to even have a consensus. If we think that there's 2 or 3 ways to go on something, then let's keep it at 2 or 3 ways to kind of address the problem however we want to do it. So there's no need to kind of edit ourselves at all yet. And then again, just like we've been doing, just to kind of make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. We've got a lot of different types of expertise on this committee. So if we might kind of go big bucket at a time and just kind of get some ideas out according to, again, maybe buildings and housing, and then land use, and then transportation, and then all of the above kind of stuff. But I'm going to, again, let Camille and Gina do this, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see what Colleen's writing down for us as we kind of go. But I think we've already got a lot of great ideas going, so that's great.
Do we need to see the? Yeah, let's see.
So,
No, that's good.
So, Charles, can we also, as we go through these, I think it would be great to list who wants to be part of working on these, and are we aiming to get two or three people on each, or individuals to take them? Z's got the first one.
I would say it's up to the group how we want to do that. If we
Okay.
want to just throw ideas out for a long time, I don't want you to feel like that if you set an idea, you have to be in charge of writing it out. It might just be a good idea that somebody else is actually better at kind of fleshing out. So I don't want to like limit us in that way.
Okay.
So we could just talk for a while and then do homework, it might be that we need to kind of assign 3 or 4 people a lot of things, and they can kind of then go back and sub-assign kind of within that too. So I don't
So
want to.
we could write it out and then have a kind of a Google sign up.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's
So
going to
that we
happen
don't have to do that right now. Okay.
Right. We might not want to do. I do think that I would love for people to kind of be able to kind of volunteer themselves in areas where they feel strongly about, whether from an expertise point of view or just a passion point of view. And then Camille and Gina and I, the chairs, can talk afterwards about making sure that it's clear that all the different ideas have a follow-up.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Gina, but you want to take buildings and housing, and how do
Sure. So we're gonna walk through some of these strategies and actions and see there are.
Gina, your audio is Gina, your connection's really strange. Is everybody else hearing that?
Yeah, she's with the Borg.
Yeah, she's with the Borg.
No.
Yeah, it's still like that. Try a few things. If you need to leave and come back, we can do that too. I can make sure you get back in if you need to do that.
All right, I can try.
I'll keep us moving. So we started on, we used reduced carbon footprint of new construction as an example at the beginning. We got some good actions. Anything else that we need to include on here? Help the state promote industries. Sorry, Mark?
In sort of the big idea category, maybe, and this could apply to new construction and retrofits, but a state-run comprehensive energy efficiency program, similar to those in other places like Texas and Wisconsin, or some that I know of. I know Entergy, for example, runs some, but one that's actually administered outside of the utilities themselves. Oftentimes it's run through the PSCs or their kind of equivalent in a state. Can provide, resources, guidance, incentives, et cetera, to promote some of these things on the new construction and retrofit side.
That's
for
great.
Housing, commercial, and industrial.
Thank you. Anything else to add to this list? Jeanette says International Energy Efficiency Code, similar to the building code.
Within this particular action, are we limiting this to the building footprint, or do we also want to talk about like lot development standards, or just development standards in general that would?
I think that would go under a different strategy, Kim, right? Would that go, that would be more under land use. Well, I guess that's connected.
Let's put it down, and then we can put it somewhere else later if we want to. Kim, what's it called?
Just thinking about setting maybe maximum lot coverage requirements, or just exploring different lot development standards that would minimize, kind of impervious surface and also be kind of compatible with some of the other things we're trying to do in terms of increasing individual lot resiliency or homeowner resiliency.
Okay. Any others? Hearing none. we'll move on to equitable retrofits of existing structures to lower greenhouse gas emissions and increase energy and water efficiency. Will include quality of life improvements as co-benefits in that write-up. So we've got the broadband access, historic district challenge, and I think Nathan Lott is on the call, and we'll need to, he's an expert on the historic district piece, so we'll need to tap into his knowledge on that. Promote major industries to lead on climate mitigation actions in their buildings and operations. Any other actions to add under this strategy?
This is Fallon. I would, so two things. One is that I actually think that this is where the documentation and assessment of existing buildings goes underneath that. I mean, and utilizing existing buildings is, it's somewhat, it's not exactly the same. Retrofit is a form of, adaptation. And so I'm not sure, utilization, we want to flesh that out in a different way, but those two things can actually overlap. The second, sorry, go ahead. You're going to say something?
Oh, no.
The second thing I would note with kind of historic buildings, sites, and districts is that there's a lot of differentiation amongst designation and regulation. And so we would really need to, I guess in a kind of high level, account for differentiation. And I mean, that would obviously entail like whether that's mapping that out relative to these different models. But if we're aiming for equity, there's a lot of difference in both the capital available to a property owner, if it's depending upon how it's listed, how it's designated. So in terms of access to tax credits and things of that nature. So and grants.
Thank you, Fallon. Are there other thoughts under the equitable retrofits of existing structures? And on utilize existing buildings, structures, and infrastructure, that also gets into the land use piece. That is more around utilizing existing stock so that we're not developing new. So actions around that.
Where the healthcare.
It's what?
This is where I said this is where I think the healthcare suggestion that Kevin brought up earlier could really go, and maybe this could be expanded beyond, like, when we say buildings, structures, infrastructure. I mean, that really includes all the kind of operational infrastructure as well. So.
Oh, that
Camille, I'd piggyback off of the comment earlier about documenting and assessing existing buildings here too, to say, having a reliable inventory of vacant properties that could be available for redevelopment or otherwise would be helpful data for local governments, especially.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
I think in this, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Kim, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in this utilizing existing structures and infrastructure, I mean, one of the challenges is it's, more attractive to develop green space areas than to renovate existing buildings. And so incentivizing in some way, we're thinking about how do we incentivize redevelopment in areas where it makes sense to redevelop, versus, sprawling development.
So as an example, we have state historic tax credits, which have made a huge difference in a lot of projects, but it triggers a whole bunch of historic preservation, and it's only available to buildings of a certain age and older, speaking as a person of a certain age and older. one of the things that's a real disincentive for existing buildings is that there's the mitigation costs of dealing with hazardous materials that tend to have been in existing buildings. And to my knowledge, we don't actually have a tax credit that covers that. And that, could tip the balance in the redevelopment of buildings. It's often, the certain amount of money you have to spend to get the building back to zero, as it were. And in terms of health impacts, the removal of lead paint and the mitigation of that is a huge one and has a huge implication on the health, especially of children.
And I also that as we look at existing buildings and looking at the green space or landscaping that's on that property, many times those existing buildings have a lot of property space that again could be utilized better for landscaping, tree planting, they're helping emissions, as well as the structure itself, which could also, as we talk about including green space, some of that green space is connected to those existing properties, not just standalones, but also standalones in relation, particularly in residential areas that where there once was housing and no longer, but some of those lots are extensive buildings where that could be utilized better for green space landscaping as well.
Thank you, Arthur. Kevin?
Yeah, much of the success of the Boston Healthcare Coalition was jump-started by the Barr Foundation. And they said that was sort of, they could have met. Really, the Barr Foundation provided the funding to do the initial energy assessments of the healthcare sector. And that really made the whole thing prosper. So maybe that should be considered. I think this is a good opportunity for a variety of foundations to become involved in, particularly if we can carve out specific asks of them that could be coordinated from the state or this committee.
Great, thank you. I have two things, and this might go under equitable, the second one, equitable retrofits. What about a weatherization program to upgrade homes and especially low income and low income areas, weatherproofing homes? I know that's been done in a lot of states, and
yeah, there's funding streams for that already. I think it's just you could double, triple the funding, the annual funding stream, and probably still not have enough money. But yeah, it's a very popular program.
And then there was one other one. Jeanette, are you on? Jeanette did a lot of research around this, and you found something about a mobile home replacement program.
Yes, I did. I believe it is in Montana or maybe Pennsylvania. I will look up the exact reference, but they realized that mobile homes built before 1976 are just, they have no energy efficiency, anything. And so it's a huge energy cost to the person living in the mobile home, but it's also, it doesn't help when you're trying to reduce carbon emission. And so they developed a program to replace pre-1976 mobile homes to provide the, mobile home owners with more energy efficient housing. That also actually reduces the cost burden on them. So the whole energy poverty thing was being addressed with that as well, to some extent.
So that dovetails with the aligning these actions with disaster recovery, because at least from the Office of Community Development standpoint, we won't repair or retrofit a mobile home. We will only replace it with a completely modernized, up-to-date mobile home, etc. So that makes sense. And we're also looking at other alternatives to mobile homes, especially in certain like coastal areas that maybe is not the best option. Special flood hazard area, you have to elevate them, et cetera. So, you know, alternatives like relocation or other types of housing that's, you know, either modular or, you know, small stick-built alternatives.
Mhm. So we'll keep going. Gina, I'll keep on this and then hand over to you at land use planning. Okay, so include green space landscaping. I know we have a lot in our that's already been sent to us by Dr. Ning. Anything else on including green space landscaping on actions that we should include?
Could we broaden that a little to include green infrastructure?
Green space, buildings and green infrastructure. Mm-hmm.
Stormwater gardens, other water quality features. And I would include permeable construction methods, underground storage, things like that that assist with detention.
Colleen, could you hear her? Gina? Gina, you're breaking up a little bit again.
I think she just added it at the top at the high level.
Okay,
It's
okay.
a office building that hasn't been brought up to date. No, I'm just kidding. I was saying I would include like permeable
buildings
and building materials, and you know, in lieu of concrete, and then like underground detention and alternative modes of detention to help with stormwater efficiency.
A lot of places have green roof programs. We should include that. I mean, the sky's the limit, right?
That's right.
Any other thoughts, team?
I don't know how consumer oriented we want this to go, but some other states have and counties have rules on, or some have rules, some just have promotional materials for using alternative grass and kind of more native species and planting. And that's one of those kind of more light touch things that could be a part of the portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Kim's comment.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, Gina, you're not sounding good again. But Kim does have something in the comments in the chat. She says that we could include best practices or updates to land development codes to include and or encourage more landscaping, tree retention, green infrastructure, these kinds of things. And that maybe that's a segue into the codes thing, which is next, where, you know, we can categorize it differently later.
Yeah. Okay. So review and update building codes. Thoughts here? There's a lot here.
Well, the easiest thing that people have said is we could catch up with Texas, if that's not already disappointing enough, and upgrade our energy code to the most current one as they have.
Mm-hmm.
We're still on the 2007 code. So we're 14 years, our code is 14 years old now.
Okay.
And remember, these upgrades have every time they revise these every 3 years, they do detailed analysis to prove that whatever they're requiring is actually the most cost effective for the building owner. Meaning we, in my architecture firm, we design to the last one that was approved. It's widespread adoption, actually 2016. And we can show them that actually designing to that, even though the code only requires us to do 2007, is actually the most cost-effective way for their building. It's the least cost of ownership path for them. And for building owners who are going to own their building, so the people who developed it have already done all the hard work figuring out what are the cost-effective requirements. The only people that quote hurts is people who intend to flip a property, a poorly performing property, and let somebody else, deal with the high energy bills. So what we want to do is have a level playing field where the people who are owner operators and the people who are developing to flip are both meeting this thing that helps us minimize total cost of ownership for the people who live in buildings and who rent space in buildings.
I just want a follow-up to that, though. This ultimately raises the cost for especially small businesses, but businesses in kind of lower income neighborhoods that have lower margins. And so, because they tend not to own the property that they occupy, that they rent.
Right,
and
but that actually lowers their rent from what it would be, right?
It doesn't necessarily get passed on.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Those savings don't get passed on ordinarily.
Yeah.
And so there are some creative ways to incentivize in the same ways that we, have kind of affordable housing programs to incentivize like affordable leasing to businesses, because that's going to be, people will scream Bloody Mary when you decide to kind of in a regulated way make the kind of upfront costs more expensive. So that might be one outside the box. I'm not sure it will have any kind of political capital.
Thank you. Gina put walkability. Gina, are you working?
I was trying to talk earlier about, we were talking about updates to land development codes, and that's what I was trying to say when I was probably coming over as a robot again.
Okay.
So I typed walkability.
Thank you.
And I would just say, just watching the time, if we want to switch to land use for a little while, we can always come back to some of these ideas if we have extra time.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Charles. So we're going to align disaster recovery, mitigation, adaptation programs with climate adaptation goals, and we're going to include as Kim mentioned, the water initiative in there, the Watershed Initiative. And so electrification of buildings and increased access to capital ability to participate in climate program. We'll build those out. We'll put that in the list to build out. Is that what you're saying, Charles?
Well, I don't know. Those are pretty good and pretty big. I'm just saying, let's not just be conscious that we have a whole nother big category to do. And then that's all.
Yeah.
We don't.
Okay.
Let's spend some time on these. These are big. I think if we have ideas from people on there.
All right.
I think increased access to capital and ability to participate in climate programs is a really big one, that overarching issue. This might be, a finance cross-sector type issue, but, and we keep talking about these things in terms of like the, equity, which I think is incredibly important, but we also have to think about the rest of the population and why, if they're not financially unable to either require these energy efficiency measures or are not, don't seek them out, et cetera, why not? And how do we either incentivize or not mandate, but, require in some way, basically everyone to have the high, the highest or at least the mid-level level of energy efficiency in construction when it comes to new construction or renovations, rehabs, et cetera. Regardless of, regardless of ability, level the playing field. But if you aren't in, low to moderate income, how come you're not actually seeking that out? I mean, there's got to be some kind of education gap or something.
Does anyone know the status of PACE financing in Louisiana?
So it's still allowed, and there was a new move to kind of revisit it recently. Fano, I know, has been looking at implementing something in its parish. It's allowed statewide and implemented parish by parish. My understanding is that it got passed in Jefferson Parish, and there's an old kind of a tweaked version that Fano has been looking at in New Orleans, but maybe we should gather that information and pass it around to the group. I mean, the difficulty with all these things is, hi, here's my lightweight program and here's my lawyer to explain it to me. What we need are things that are simpler if we're going to work at scale.
It's been in other places a great tool for increasing access to capital in terms of.
And I would say, I think it did come up on the power committee meeting the other day in terms of kind of making that linkage to. Anyway, so I think it has been raised before. I think it's a good thing to kind of look into.
Also might be an avenue for bringing broadband to homes also.
And, I just realized, having a home solar program and those incentives increased, and we didn't even mention that yet.
I'd also add maybe in this category that a lot of these goals and objectives can be added as incentives or requirements on existing tax credit programs in terms of implementation. And so we may not need to kind of invent new programs so much as revamp existing ones.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Fallon. Thank you. Because we did have, yeah. Any other thoughts under increase access to capital to participate in climate programs? Colleen, do we need to go back up one? I thought, yeah, okay, so electrification of buildings. Any thoughts here on actions for that?
I think Z brought something up at the beginning of the call just about not locking people into fossil fuels forever. Is there a specific action there?
Well, I think the question is there's two levels. One is, what do we do from an information perspective? If you're in a mixed neighborhood, the losses in the neighborhood grid are going to be there whether you're connected or not. But moving people towards that, what some cities have done is they've started to say no new natural gas hookups for buildings, because eventually that will result in a slow conversion. That's one thing that, and it's received a lot of pushback as well. But I'm just ticking off the kinds of things people do. I think the real issue is one of when we're talking about whole new neighborhoods and developments, what we do. And all of this needs to be thought of in conjunction with whatever the utility commission group is doing in terms of storage and resilience of the grid. Because so on my own house, speaking as a person with privilege, we have, we've converted down to, I think we have an inline natural gas water heater, and that's all that we have left on natural gas. Everything else is heat pumps, and we have batteries. And so when the power, things hit, we're covered. We've also done this on affordable housing very affordably. A 50-unit apartment building done with battery backup for $160 a square foot. So we know that that's doable and affordable. But we might think of what would it take, and I don't have a prescriptive sense, not the hard fist of no new connections, but just we should think through what are the policies that would move us in that direction, and reserve, the use of fossil fuels to what the Princeton guy was talking about in terms of, when we go through, 3 weeks of no wind and no sun. It doesn't sound like Louisiana, but when we go through that, how do we get through that period? And that's probably going to involve fossil fuels that have been stored. So if we can get it down to that, we're drastically lower fossil fuel levels. So I think that's the question. Is I don't have an answer for the easy policies. The easy thing are the kind of Berkeley solution, no new hookups, but that's a pretty, that's a pretty non-Louisiana approach. So the question is, what could we do? What could we do that would be much more nuanced?
Land use is so important with that because, at least from my experience, the power companies, they're going to go and they're going to put lines in where they can get numbers and density and new customers. And unless you have, land use restrictions that actually have some teeth in them, or restriction, a plan, then you're going to have this sprawl, and they will basically lead the way. And so that's something that I think we have to get a hold of. And it's not easy to do, but it can be done.
Well, that's a perfect segue because it goes into the land use piece. And I just want to flag we have 30 minutes. And so I know we're not going to finish this, but we are going to be able to regroup and sign up and work in pairs and to flesh all of this out before we bring it back to the whole body. So Gina, do you want me to run through this given your intermittent issues? Now I can.
Okay. I can't tell that I sound funny. So you have to tell me.
You go in and out.
I'm sorry. Well, I could try and get started, and then you just tell me if it sounds too bad, and then I'll shut up.
Go ahead.
So, coordinate land use practices across jurisdictions, municipal, regional, statewide, to mitigate risk and manage the vulnerabilities that create barriers to building resilience. That's a lot of words. Okay, so to mitigate risk and manage vulnerabilities. So I think with respect to land use practices, to me, one of the biggest areas of action would be to provide some type of, at least state guidance that would incentivize or even require comprehensive land use plans to be meaningful and to have some basic requirements in them, because right now and correct me if I'm wrong, but from my experience, they are all over the board. They're not necessarily taking into account any of the issues that we're discussing today. And not only that, but they don't have any teeth in them. So the best laid plans often wind up 10 years later having actually, no benefit. So that's one thing that I see as an action. Any other thoughts either on that or some other type of action that would impact this one?
Nina Fallon had a comment in the chat that's.
Oh, this is for electrification. We need to include water storage as an energy storage. Yeah, that's a good point.
And before that too, Fallon, do you want to talk about eco districts? And
I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
That's okay. I was just throwing a bunch of stuff in there. I figured it was a lot easier to just copy and paste.
I'm gonna do the same.
Yeah, so I was just saying that there's a number of models, each with their own branding, whether it's net zero, zero waste, eco districts. I think a lot of them could have applicability here, but we would have to really assess that applicability. So I think that's part of the planning part of land use planning.
And are there specific examples or models that you're thinking of?
They
More
use
places, maybe?
net
Yeah.
zeros in Brooklyn, eco districts in Boston. There's a number of lead NDs. They're quite popular in Chicago, as well as what's it called? What's the city? I'll remember the other city in there.
Any more rural, less urban areas, examples that you can think of? That would be helpful.
Chattanooga is the one that's mentioned, which is not rural, I recognize, but it's mentioned in regards to it being a model for smaller like cities and like large towns. So just because of its population size and land use pattern. So that's not for lead. That's actually, it's one of those like Google gig cities. And so it's much more like smart city. That's the model, around the smart city model.
Yeah,
which includes a lot of energy.
That's a good one. Thank you. And Camille just made a comment about encourage land use planning that is incentivizing compact development patterns, which, you know, is key. It's difficult to do sometimes because people like their space, etc. But that's where I think the value of having you know, a comprehensive plan that that addresses these issues, but also, you know, sets the parameters and makes it and has some teeth to it.
I had one idea too, which is to kind of create an incentive-based climate capacity building program for local jurisdictions and local communities. That might include something like a climate scorecard or rating scale for land use decisions, or how a rubric for them to consider how their land use comprehensive plans may fit into climate objectives. And that may also kind of encompass some of those land use best practices. And I don't know if this has been done or if it's even possible, but it would be interesting to create a pretty a simple model to show benefits of land development policy change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions over time, and maybe to kind of set kind of a base year, and for us to be able to track land cover changes and different things that we might want to consider for best practices.
Yeah, so metrics and data are another cross-section. Not sure where that would be covered, but I think all of that is very important to, you know, obviously tracking cost benefit and your climate goals, and also to educating people. And also, you know, data's the way of the world and the way everything's going. So, you know, enhancing data and analysis of that data in this environment is definitely has to be something that is a goal, an overarching goal of all of the actions in my mind. Any other land use practices across jurisdictions to mitigate risk? You know, this is obviously, we already mentioned the Watershed Initiative, Louisiana Watershed Initiative, but this is one of the major goals of the Watershed Initiative, which is to coordinate how we manage risk with respect to water. And right now, you know, everyone has their jurisdictional boundaries with respect to how they handle stormwater and floodwaters and infrastructure, et cetera, with respect to those issues and their own funding sources. And so we're trying to break down those walls. And so I think that, you know, that translates to land use, and that translates to other issues that we're dealing with here. So I would definitely include, you know, the incorporation of these more statewide initiatives that encourage that, you know, more regional approach as opposed to localized approach to, and I see the comments jumping up and I'm trying to read it, talk at the same time. So one other element with the educational component would be to educate practitioners and decision makers to better understand and incorporate climate benefits. I agree. I was thinking, you know, for the most part, at least I would say most jurisdictions that have a comprehensive land use plan, they're gonna look to a consultant, you know, a subject matter expert to assist them with that, and or just their planning director or personnel, and those folks are subject matter experts, and so they should be well versed in this and applying these principles when they're making decisions and making recommendations to policymakers, I would think. So I think that's a very good point. I'm going to move to the next one. If we can always jump back and forth, that's the way I work. I kind of have the focus of a red ant. So plan for zero waste communities, Abita Springs models. And I'm going to show my ignorance, but what is the Abita Springs model? Considering I live like 2 miles from Abita Springs, I'm kind of embarrassed to say.
Well, I don't know who put that one on there, but I do remember the mayor pledging to be zero waste at some point. I don't know how well it's gone on the implementation side, but I do remember a few years back some pledges.
So they currently have, they have a new mayor, and they are going under, they have really old sewer infrastructure. And right now they passed a bond issue and they're putting in some new sewer infrastructure. So not sure, you know what? I'm going to take that as an action item to follow up and find out what's going on. Because I should know the answer to this. This is my parish. So plan for zero waste communities. I have to say I am kind of ignorant on this topic, so I'm going to ask for some input.
Hey, Gina, this is Mark. One potential action would just be that the state have some kind of unified plan around how to manage waste, especially like the sorting and streaming of waste. Right now, different communities or even different waste management companies do it differently. And you know, the more you can stream and segment, or the more you can segment your waste streams, the more opportunities you have to find beneficial reuses for it, whether it's waste to energy or some other recycling form.
So another example of that that links back to our industries is that there's this one independent glass recycler that collects glass from the French Quarter that I'm told actually breaks that stuff down and turns it into artificial sand that is used for sandblasting the oil rig equipment, because normally they're buying river sand for doing that when they're cleaning off their stuff. So this is like third hand, but I just give that as an example of when you tighten the loop between waste equals food, you improve the economy of the whole thing. Because right now the problem has been, if we're going to collect glass bottles and use them to make more glass bottles, which would be a kind of an ideal, I guess, the challenge has been that the capture range is, it's hard to make the economics work. The nearest place that can melt and make glass bottles is hundreds and hundreds of miles away. The cost of hauling the stuff up there, melting it down and coming it back, the net carbon savings can be modest and the costs can be big. But finding uses for these waste streams that are more direct. I grew up in a small town where they had two industries. One was a picture frame company, and the other was a toothpick company. This is in the forested area. And my mom was city clerk, and she realized that she could, the picture frame company was paying to have their waste wood hauled away. She just introduced them to the toothpick company, which could feed in and turn that material into toothpicks. And so it lowered the one's cost, made both companies more economically viable. So, I mean, it's an anecdote, and I know that the plural of anecdote is not data, but what we could look for are these opportunities to link supply and demand of materials together in ways that produce less waste.
And I would just point out too that we do have a waste in general as part of the agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste group. So we do have other folks kind of thinking directly about this. If there are no other ideas about how to plan around reducing waste on the community scale or the land use scale, we can certainly move on. And
yeah,
I have a question for the land use group, because this is the land use group, and I'd be remiss with Camille Manning-Broom on the call not to ask this, which is that the hardest thing, right, is everyone hates traffic. We spend a lot of money adding another lane to our highways, and then the traffic grows to fill that. And then we add a lot of money to add another lane, and we're basically subsidizing sprawl. And the problem is politicians love to be there for ribbon cutting that new lane that will relieve traffic congestion, at least for the next 3 years until the traffic, picks up to fill the available capacity. So it's a politically fraught question, and I just don't know if Louisiana is ready to go there, but it does seem kind of, counterproductive to be at the state level planning for continued expansion to meet traffic demand, when in the end, what we're really doing is not making there be any less traffic, we're just making there be more sprawl.
Yes, this is a daily conversation in our office.
I figure this is your job, not mine, but go ahead, please.
But there are ways to get around that. One is having a focus on a statewide focus on transit and a transit plan to expand that out. And then the second, and what a lot of places are doing, is around reducing VMTs, vehicle miles traveled. And there's challenges around that. And this morning we were talking with the members of the transportation sector committee to really figure out what is it that we can do in rural, majority rural Louisiana, to really reduce VMTs and promote transit and disincentivize sprawl. And we came up with some stuff, and we can talk about that when we start writing that action template, because it's going to be a cross-sectoral action item that needs to be done in coordination with the transportation committee, because it's just perpetuated through our investments.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. And people, my background is with respect to a high growth community parish in the state, and experiencing extreme transportation issues, but also wanting to be able to have 1 acre, 5 acre lots with, driving to school, driving to work, driving to church, but why is the traffic so bad? And we went back to, okay, yes, there are some short-term fixes we can do, but ultimately we're, by the time we build it, we've grown out of it. So you're back to land use and some of these other, transportation, changing the type of transportation and the mode. And some of that is not just supply, it's also demand, and making people, want to or change their attitudes. Anyway, so it's a huge issue, but I think it is twofold. And one, it goes back to the to the whole idea of land use. And I think one thing that we haven't talked about, and I don't know if it's an action or what, but we're talking in terms of the user, but we're not really talking about the landowners. And that is ultimately one of the big issues that comes up is, hey, you want to restrict my use of my land. And I don't have an answer, but I think it's something that definitely needs to be addressed with respect to land use planning. And how do we say, okay, I'm sorry, you thought you were going to be able to use this for highway commercial, but now we're not putting that, we're never going to put a road there. And so a more appropriate use is farmland.
Hardest issue in a market strategy, in a market-based approach, one thing is you can do what you like, however, you have to pay the full impact. And the full impact is now we have to build a road, now we have to build a sewage treatment plant, and so on. And so obviously this is, everyone involved in this much more deeply than I knows this, but it's development impact fees. Normally we do them the other way. We subsidize huge installations and say, we'll build the roads, we'll do everything for you if you'll give me this one photo op that I can be there when we open this one, this one new project with 100 new jobs, and that all looks real good. But what we've done is we've stuck everyone in the state of Louisiana, we've handed them the bill so that you can have your photo op. So I think what we need to do is, if not being draconian and saying, no, you're not allowed to do that, it's the other way around. I think to get back to zero, where people actually have to pay the impact of their decisions, might be a middle ground that you could stretch in Louisiana.
Or be compensated for the opportunity lost through transfer development rights or conservation easements or what have you. The one thing I'd like to just add is sort of relative to what we already have, like retrofitting what we already have is just thinking kind of in a more distributed way about our infrastructure. So, I'm sure a lot of you experienced during the COVID shutdown, food trucks and things that maybe came to your area or your neighborhood when you weren't able to go to restaurants. And, one truck coming to your neighborhood that serves 200 people versus 200 people getting in 200 cars and going somewhere is a pretty positive sort of exchange rate on the carbon that's being used. But even beyond that, thinking more distributed about water and stormwater. So things like rain barrels and green infrastructure and water storage on property and backup power, whether it be solar generator and battery storage. Different things that can be done where we can't in the foreseeable future maybe change the development pattern of the land use itself to take a more kind of distributed approach the sum may be as beneficial or close enough to trying to make some huge intervention or large scale project.
I'd like to also note, and Kim Marisek's on the call and can speak to this, but including in the state's transportation improvement plan and the MPO's plans that are done for the different regions, a guiding principle of reducing VMTs in their public, in their investments and their prioritization of projects would be helpful. That could, that is a lot of resources that go towards building out a lot of those roads. And if there was a way that could be measured and alternatives such as transit alternatives included would be ideal.
So we're kind of running short on time because I want to be able to sign out some things. We want to be able to talk about the next meeting and then also hear some public comment before our 4 o'clock. So I just want to read a few things quickly from the chat just so that the public can hear them, and we will get those into the notes for us to kind of follow up on later. So I see just infrastructure for walkability being raised a couple times, consumer subsidies for electric bikes, and apparently Houston has a pilot underway or in the works. Also incentivizing ride shares. A lot of these are falling under the transportation kind of category, it looks like, and HOV lanes, compact development, infill, and then TDR and conservation trust funds also kind of under there. And so just calling those out just in case the public watching can't see the chat. And I think we've done a great job of really putting a lot of good ideas on the table. And this is not the only chance to do this. This is just a way to kind of get this smart group of people together to kind of think about it together. And I think we're off to a really good start. So if it's okay, Gina and Camille, unless there are any other ideas, maybe did anybody, I guess, before just kind of thinking about zooming all the way back out before we kind of switch, did anybody have an action that didn't get said or didn't fit under one of these categories that they just wanted to bring up? Maybe Andronika or Arthur or somebody who hasn't spoken in a while? Well, that's great. So, oh wait, did somebody? Well, great. So then I think kind of to figure out how we want to kind of assign out, maybe Gina and Camille, and y'all feel free to speak up, but do we want to kind of think in terms of maybe people could volunteer themselves for one of these larger buckets like building and housing, and then so we at least kind of understand who to draw from when we kind of try to think about how to kind of make sure that some of these ideas get developed further. Does that sound okay, Gina? I saw you.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to start.
Okay, so does anybody want to volunteer themselves to be kind of, somebody that we can lean on under the buildings and housing category as these actions get kind of further developed?
Can Charles, so to be
please.
clear, what we want is individuals to sign up to help fill out the action templates on these different pieces, right?
I would say either fill them out themselves or in conjunction with other people, or to help find a home for that action idea to get filled out by somebody else. So I would not say that you have to, don't be scared off by the categories that have the most actions. I think we can also farm this out to folks in our networks and to people around that we know. So that's the kind of other side of that coin.
I don't know if it helps to split it this way. Conceptually, what I'd been thinking about was there's the carbon footprint of construction, which means building materials. And then there's the carbon footprint of operating buildings, whether they're new or retrofitted or existing. And the new and existing buildings, we can talk about energy codes, retrofit programs, and so on. The carbon footprint of construction is a fairly sealed, it's a problem that is kind of separate from, it's what goes into making the concrete, what goes into making the steel, how the wood is grown and harvested and so on. And so you might think of breaking that out into its own little thing, because that makes it more tractable versus energy efficiency programs and things. Those are all great and incredibly important, but they're kind of separable from the carbon emissions associated with building materials.
That makes sense to me. I see Colleen kind of furiously writing over there. Kind of.
And so just two different strategies.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a different strategy. There's a materials strategy, and then there's a building efficiency and health strategy.
Right.
And Charles, does each action item have to have its own? Does it have to be filled out on its own, or could reduce carbon footprint of new constructions that be submitted with all the details under it?
Right. What I think is going to happen is we're going to have to go back and make sure that some things that got put in one strategy, there's going to be some combining, I think, and there's going to be some, some of these, almost kind of like Z was saying just now, just some of these ideas like building codes might fit under a couple of these things. We have it as its own strategy. And so we just need to do some reorganizing before we get, too much further down down here. So we're going to need to look at these notes and think about them. And I think we can do that with the chairs and myself and Colleen. We can kind of reorganize and kind of get set up. But I guess just from this point, could we just kind of separate ourselves into folks who are open and willing to kind of, want to call themselves buildings and housing strategies experts versus maybe our land use experts versus our cross-sectoral transportation-y ones, or some others that are maybe cross-sectoral in other sectors. First.
Charles, this is Mark. I would not call myself a buildings and housing expert, but I do have a fair amount of experience with state energy efficiency programs. So at least for that one action item, if I can be helpful to whoever takes up this category.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. And yes, I don't mean to call you an expert if that makes you uncomfortable, but you know what I mean? I think you guys know what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Can we lump retrofits into that, Mark?
Yeah, I think that'd be fine.
And Charles, just to reiterate for the group, I had told you that my team will do the legwork on the land use piece and coordinating with whatever members here want to participate and be part of that. So, and I see Kim has, which I'm glad she did because she's an expert on land use and transportation.
Great. Thanks, Camille. Thanks, Kim.
This is Arthur. I'll work with the land use group.
Great.
Fabulous. Do you feel like you're a buildings and housing kind of guy? Seems like it, or
yeah,
at least some portion of it.
The nice thing is everyone on this committee is interested in all these topics and sees how they all connect. So just let's allocate people where they do the most good and make sure it's well spread.
Yeah, great.
This is Mark. I'd also be happy to take on the infrastructure category as well.
Thank you, Mark.
You can add me, Fallon, to buildings and to land use.
Thank you, Fallon. And Dr. Ning, I always struggle with where you fit best. What do you think you want to be involved in? Land use, or is it on the other side?
Wherever you put me, I'm going to be there working.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful as well.
That's awesome.
Well, this is a good start, guys. I'm not going to force everybody to kind of pick something now. We can kind of be back in touch. Like I said, Camille and Gina and I are going to kind of reorganize this a little bit. We've got a sense for where certain people feel like they can do the most good or the least amount of damage, however you want to think about it. And then we can be back in touch with you soon after this, if that sounds okay. Are there any just final ideas or actions that didn't get said, or anybody that wants to sign up for something that didn't get a chance to before we kind of go to the last little bit of the meeting? Okay, then I think Colleen's going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to shift gears just for a second to see if we want to elevate some ideas specifically for the April meeting. The next time we come back together, like I said, it's going to be cross-sectoral focused. Let me see. So I just wanted to see if any, just to kind of just show this notes page again. In April, we're going to be thinking about how we can best combine with other committees and advisory groups to refine these ideas, advance them. We're currently thinking there might need to be as many as, instead of one giant session like we did in February that's 4 hours long, we're thinking maybe several smaller sessions that can kind of just get at certain overlap points that we think are important. And we can mix and match different committee members once we figure out the exact right structure for this. And so today with you guys on the phone, I think we talked about a lot of things that were cross-sectoral. Are there any actions or themes that you think we just have to talk about as an overlap with somebody else? I know transportation's come up a lot. Power ideas, power sector came up a lot. I just want to turn it over to you guys to flag things now that we want to cover.
Well, I've already mentioned this, but I think in the despite my best efforts, there will be huge amounts of road building coming into the future. And so one of the ways that the state can have tremendous impact is both planning, making sure we, build only the roads we absolutely need versus some politician would like to get. And secondly, that when we build roads, we do it with the least carbon materials in ways that promote a Louisiana industry innovating its way to lower carbon materials. So in some states, they have these buy clean things that basically inventory what's available within the state. And then they just say for any state funded project, you have to be in the top 25%, or in this sense, the 25th percentile of the lowest carbon footprint of those choices. And I think that could have an impact in it, but it's an opportunity to build a connection with the industry that needs to make these changes, because it's an opportunity to innovate.
Great example, great idea.
There's
Anybody else
another
have
one
something?
where we have these petrochemical industries where, for example, ethanol production often produces carbon dioxide directly as part of the process. And there are opportunities within the state for storing that, sequestering that CO2 if we set the incentives up the right way. So again, we know that from the inventory from 10 years ago, a huge fraction of our total footprint isn't our buildings directly, it's the industry that's here. And so we need to look for opportunities to do that. That's totally in their area. But again, any place where there's an intersection between the use of what those industries are doing and building materials and so on, I think it's a place to reach out and connect. So for example, there's a form of concrete called Blue Planet where they bubble captured CO2 through certain kinds of water with minerals in the water, and they actually make the aggregate, and therefore they sequester the CO2 in the aggregate of the concrete. So you actually end up with, if you want to think about it this way, you could think about it as carbon negative concrete, right? So that's a tremendous opportunity, but somebody has to say, if you do this, if you build this plant, the state will buy it if you can deliver it at this price for state highway projects. It's those kind of actions where we could set a price so it's fair to the taxpayers, that's competitive, but we say, if you do it, we'll buy this much of it. It's kind of the same thing that happened where the government said, if you produce a vaccine that's proven to work, we will buy 100 million doses. And so what it does is it gives them, in a sense, a guaranteed market at a known price. And you just have to make sure that that price is fair.
Colleen, I think this idea of linking procurement opportunities, linking private sector with big purchasing power is a good one that hasn't really come up to, not just in transportation, but I think I'm hearing that as an idea that could be interesting across multiple sectors. Camille, I think you had an idea too. Did you come off mute a second ago?
Well, I just want to emphasize the power distribution piece, especially as if there are going to be larger goals around emission reduction and the promotion of renewables, and there are a number of legal questions around ordinances and things that, those solar farms and so forth might go down to the local level. And so a larger conversation about power distribution and legal rights around that as well. Just because some parishes don't have zoning, some of the rural ones where there's more interest of solar. So I think we'll need to talk with the legal team about that.
Fallon, I see your hand.
The presentations on equity and justice from the all hands meeting, I think would be great if there was a follow-up on procurement policies that are oriented towards these sectors in particular, and as well as, so in terms of those big purchases, but also in terms of construction as well. That's not procurement, it's contracting. So procurement and contracting would be one area which I think we could have a lot of impact on who benefits from this transition and ensuring that that is more equitable than just a blanket policy.
That's great. That's It's really great. Because we don't, and I think that's a great example of how we don't want to just think about crossing, transportation and land use or power and land use. We also want to think about these other fundamental objectives and the best ways to kind of think about where we want to end up as a state and what kinds of other co-benefits we should be achieving. So anybody else have any other ideas for this cross-sector kind of a meeting? Even in the chat, let's see, is there something else in the chat? Oh yeah, great, yeah. Takings and land use rights. Gina, does that fit under this, or where do you have that in mind for?
Oh, well, and it kind of dovetails into what Camille was saying. It's kind of the flip side of it. So yeah, especially with respect to landowners and regulating land use, and there's a lot of issues involved with that from a developer standpoint. So that kind of fits into kind of where Camille was going. So great minds think alike.
Okay.
Charles, for clarification, the April all hands cross-sector review workshop. So are we going to break into groups, or I was thinking we might reach out and have some of these conversations prior to that.
Yeah, there's nothing that's stopping us from getting the ball rolling. I think we're just trying to think about what's the best way to kind of purposefully organize ourselves to have everybody involved in April, kind of before the public submissions come in, kind of how can we kind of best use this time to further get some of these actions rolling. And so I think if that can happen at the member to member scale, that's great. But is there a different opportunity to have this conversation in a bigger way for the public? I think that's, and for everybody's benefit, I think that we're looking for.
And that by that time, we'll have a lot of our action templates filled out where we have thought through the sector needs and input too. So we'll have more insights there.
I think so. And so unless somebody has something to add, I'm going to see if it's okay with our chairs if we move into public comment and we kind of start seeing where we are. I think we got a lot of good stuff today. I really appreciate everybody's time. And I have 2 public comments now in the email. And so if it's okay with everybody, I'll read those in. And as we do that, folks that are on the, well, actually, how about anybody on the call? Do you want to make one? I see Jane, I think you're both on the as an attendee, and you submitted something. So Jane, do you want to speak it into the record, or would you rather me read into your email? Or I can circulate that afterwards too.
I'm happy to speak it into the record if that's okay with y'all.
Great, please.
I like it better this way.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you, committee members. I'm encouraged to see a discussion of zero waste models as a climate-friendly initiative, and specifically as a land use and community planning issue. Waste in Louisiana has a significant climate impact, and a significant proportion of that waste is from single-use materials like plastic. The Center for International Environmental Law estimates that by 2050, the comprehensive greenhouse gas footprint of plastic production, use, and disposal would be equivalent to 615 new coal-fired power plants being brought online. In fact, the United Nations is on the verge of negotiating a new international treaty on plastics to stop the global plastic pollution crisis. This crisis is increasingly understood to be an environmental, climate, and human health concern. The state of Louisiana alone is permitting dozens of new plastic production facilities with a total footprint of millions of tons of CO2 annually, which was read into the record in my public comment yesterday. These facilities should not be built just to produce more single-use waste. The state should prioritize the development of different industries that don't produce and don't perpetuate a global and local waste crisis. The processing of waste through either recycling or burning technologies is also unjustifiably climate intensive. Burning technologies, so-called waste to energy, are heat and therefore energy intensive. And in fact, these facilities have been shown to be net negative consumers of energy, not producers. They also typically fail financially, harming a community and not solving the problem. Waste is expensive in other ways too. For the average city in Louisiana, waste management is one of the top 3 line item local costs, usually second only to public safety. Land use planning around waste should be focused on prevention. We should be designing and redesigning our communities to eliminate the need for single use, especially as packaging. The layout of our cities and rural communities should promote sound waste collection and management, disincentivizing dumping. Businesses like restaurants and grocery stores should receive tax incentives and community support for redesign that is focused on reuse and refill. We have to rethink the ways we work and eat to reduce the need for food on the go, choosing instead an economy-wide, slower approach that emphasizes whole, locally grown and raised foods. The people of our state should have affordable, zero waste options for their everyday lives. The industries of our state should also be required to implement waste prevention strategies. Our state's economy should not depend on the production of single-use materials, which create a worldwide environmental, climate, and human health scourge. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Kendall Dix or Kim Goodell, do you want to make a comment while you're here since you're on? I can allow you to talk. I'll just put you both to allow to talk if you would like to. If not, I have one other comment that was emailed in to climate@la.gov. And this is from the Baton Rouge group of the Sierra Club. And they say they welcome the opportunity to offer the following comments to the Land Use, Buildings, and Housing Sector Committee of the Louisiana Climate Initiatives Task Force. This committee's work encompasses some of the major elements of climate change as a local issue. Land use, specifically poor planning, governance, and policies, is a problem across much of Louisiana. Development of floodplains has raised the cost of flood disasters as well as the vulnerabilities of communities and residents, and at the same time is causing the loss of natural habitats such as wetlands, bottomland hardwood forests, and riparian areas that can also sequester and store carbon as they provide natural flood infrastructure. East Baton Rouge Parish can be seen as a poster child for these problems. The future BR plan, the comprehensive master plan for the parish, includes language calling for the protection of watersheds, wetlands, and floodplains. Yet this language has consistently been ignored with ongoing development of high-risk flood areas, even following the record flood event of August 2016. The Baton Rouge group of the Sierra Club has voiced our concerns over these issues repeatedly in local BRSC comments. Land Use, Buildings, and Housing Sector Committee they've repeated these issues repeatedly, local forums and media stories. Secondly, on buildings, standards for energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, weatherization, and water use can be supported at the local level, both for new buildings and the remodeling of existing ones. The future BR plan promoted the use of infill, focusing on existing buildings and houses rather than the ongoing subsidization of development of new land. Yet these recommendations have been followed in a very limited fashion, if at all. In EBR parish, growth patterns have for the last few decades moved capital and development into the southern part of the parish, which is also the most flood-prone section. This is clearly an issue of land use as well. In the housing sector, instituting and promoting responsible climate policies can be done in a way that addresses other needs and problems at the same time. Improving and upgrading housing for low-income areas in climate-friendly ways can also provide jobs for those same neighborhoods and communities if such efforts are organized with those aims in mind. Federal stimulus funds will provide some initial opportunities for this, as can subsequent federal, state, and private sector programs and projects. We urge the committee to aggressively address the problems outlined here as it works with state and local governments and the private sector to develop responsible climate policies for Louisiana. Sincerely, Angele Bradford, Executive Committee of the Baton Rouge Group of the Sierra Club. And that is all I see for the public comment. Camille or Gina, do you have any? Oh, I do have one other slide. I just want to put up one last reminder that no matter who's filling these out, and I'll just say it rather than screen share again. No matter who's filling out the actions are due at the end of April. So April 30th, we need either a template, an email to climate@la.gov with some, as little or as much information as you can provide. And we've also got a Google form online that you can fill out. That's just another simplified way. You can also send stuff in by mail to the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, and all that information is on the climate webpage. And actually, I see Kim Goodell would like to make a public comment. It looks like Kim, are you able to speak?
Yes, Charles, thank
Great.
you. I appreciate it. I'll make it brief. I just wanted to take the opportunity. I've been listening into almost all of the Climate Task Force Initiative online meetings, and overall, it's an incredible initiative. I really appreciate that the governor's office has undertaken this, and everyone's doing such a fine job with it. Certainly, many critical initiatives will come out of this, and it gives me great hope for Louisiana's future. With regard to today's meeting, I can't agree more with what Jane Patton had to say, and I just wanted to state that for the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And I think that's everything we have for today. So Camille or Gina, would you like to close us out or say any final words?
I think we've got our work cut out for us. So we will go through all of the ideas and probably be in contact very soon about support needed in specific areas that may not have, be covered yet by people who have graciously agreed to be subject matter experts so far. And Camille, do you have anything?
Just thank you all. And thank you so much, Colleen, for the really critical role of your good listening skills and getting everything down for us. And Charles, all your work on this too. And to all the committee members. So really grateful to be working with all of you.
And do we have a motion to adjourn? Anybody?
Motion, Mark.
May I be excused? My brain is full.
Yeah, Z and then Mark had the second, I think.
Great. All right, we'll be in touch. Thank you, Al. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.